special interest presentation of the cruise. Today we're going to be looking at the Korean War at Sea. And one of the reasons I decided to do this presentation is because to the extent that people know about the Korean War at all, they usually think of it as a land-based conflict. Some people even think it was primarily fought by the U.S. Marine Corps rather than by the other land organizations that were involved in it. But the Sea War almost never gets looked at. So that's something that I've actually written about quite a bit over the years. And a lot of what we're going to be looking at today is adapted from a book I wrote that was published in 2003, I believe. No, when was it? 2000? It was 2000, wasn't it? That's right. A book I wrote, that's right, at the beginning of the anniversary of the Korean War. A book I wrote called Fire and Ice, The Korean War, 1950 to 53. And I include a chapter in it on the Korean War at Sea. And I've adapted a lot of that along with some fresh imagery that I was able to lay hands on for purposes of our presentation today. So what we're going to be doing today is doing an overview of naval operations during the war. And it will give you sort of a snapshot of U.S. naval power and U.S. naval assets and UN naval assets, because it was a UN conflict in the middle of the 20th century. All right, so that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. And we'll take any questions and answers we can at the end as usual. And anything that I can't answer, I'll put up on one of my blogs afterwards for anyone who cares to follow up with for more information. All right? So we will jump right into it. On June 25, 1950, the Korean War began when the communist nation of North Korea sent 90,000 troops across the DMZ to conquer its southern neighbor. While much of the conflict played out on the land, forces there were often supported by naval forces, which also had their own challenges to contend with. Throughout the course of the conflict, the United States sent 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 13 aircraft carriers of various sizes, some 80 destroyers, and hundreds of support ships to the Korean theater of operations. In addition, 10 other allied nations sent ships to support the war effort. And in fact, there were, I think, a total of 18 allied nations that supported the UN defense of South Korea, including the United States and South Korea. And then I believe it was 16 other nations sent forces ranging in size from a company of airborne medics from one country, a hospital ship from another, to forces from all 3 of their air, naval, and air arms. So it really was a multinational effort. President Harry S. Truman, in fact, initially hoped that the U.S. naval and air forces alone would be able to stop the communist invasion and that it would not become necessary to deploy ground forces to the Korean Peninsula. It soon became clear, however, that naval and air forces could contain but not stop the North Korean offensive. Traditional naval operations against a similar foe had no place in the Korean War, and for the first time in U.S. history, the Navy had to tailor its operations almost exclusively to supporting ground forces. And it carried a lot of those lessons over into Vietnam. Subsequent UN domination of the waters around the Korean Peninsula gave the Allied forces ready access to supplies and denied the enemy the same benefit. In the years following World War II, the United States emerged as the world's foremost naval power, seizing the position Great Britain had held just a decade before and for the 125 years before that. Care had been taken to modernize the U.S. fleet as much as possible immediately before World War II. While the U.S. Navy was reduced in size after the war, it was not left as relatively weakened as was the Army. The Army was pretty hollowed out in the years after World War II, which did not help the U.S. In the Korean War. Between 1945 and 1950, the U.S. Navy worked to adjust its materiel and strategy to both incorporate and defend against atomic weapons, jet aircraft, and helicopters, none of which ended up helping it much in the Korean War. Political as well as technological changes contributed to the strengthening, if not the enlargement, of the U.S. Navy in the post-World War II period. Foremost among these were the emergence of the Soviet Union as a threat rivaling that posed by the Axis just a few years before, and the need to fill the vacuum left by Great Britain. Indeed, by 1950, Great Britain's naval forces in the Pacific were so weak that all the once great maritime power could contribute to the UN war effort was a single small aircraft carrier, HMS Ocean, which we can actually see here off the coast of Korea in 1952. So this is HMS Ocean while it was on deployment to the Korean War. On the other hand, when the Korean War broke out, the United States had thousands of ships in service, including more than 500 destroyers, and was able to deploy the entire 7th Fleet to the waters around Korea. All right, we're going to look at the sorts of vessels that were being used by the United States and the other combatant powers, allied combatant powers primarily, during the war, a little bit about their roles. And then after we look at the kinds of vessels that were being used and the roles that they fulfilled, we're going to go on to look at specific actions and missions that took place during the war. UN forces used a wide variety of large ships during the Korean War, including aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. And aircraft carriers and battleships are generally referred to as capital vessels because they are such a major investment. Even for a large country, a battleship or an aircraft carrier represents a large investment. Aircraft carriers are mobile bases for planes and are capable of moving them within striking distance of areas that might otherwise be inaccessible. Aircraft from Allied aircraft carriers flew missions against communist forces throughout the Korean War. An aircraft carrier's commanding officer, executive officer, operations officer, navigator, and air officer all had experience as naval aviators. And a lot of the naval aviators who became aces during the Korean War, if they had any kind of military experience at all from World War II, they'd become aces in World War II. So a lot of them were double aces. They become aces with prop-driven planes during World War II, and then in a lot of cases, the same guys became aces with jets during the Korean War. Ironically, the same was true with North Korean aircraft, which were primarily being flown by Chinese and Russian pilots. They weren't really being flown by North Koreans. A lot of them had been aces in World War II as well. Battleships. Second in size among combatant vessels, only to the largest aircraft carriers, are heavily armed and armored ships designed to operate both offensively and defensively against surface vessels. During the Korean War, their most important function was using their big guns to support amphibious assault and ground forces. And we could see an example of that from our first slide with the Iowa. This is what battleships looked like when they were shelling the North Korean coastline. Cruisers at the time of the Korean War were general utility ships capable of operating alone, in groups, or as part of a battle fleet. They served as scouts, aircraft carrier guards, screens against enemy destroyers and aircraft, and leaders of destroyer flotillas and attack groups. Destroyers are multi-purpose ships used in nearly every kind of naval operation and represent a good combination of speed, mobility, and offensive and defensive capabilities. They're also relatively cheap for warships. Destroyers led the September 1950 attack on Incheon, bombarding Sentinel Wolmi Island prior to the troop assault. And we're going to look a little bit more about the Incheon landing further on. But we could do a whole presentation just on it, so we can't get too far down in the weeds on it. Oh, and there we can see, for anyone who didn't see the caption at the bottom, that is USS Antietam, a U.S. aircraft carrier at Yokosuka, Japan, sometime between 1951 and 1952. We don't know exactly when the picture dates to, but that's when it was active in support of UN operations in the Korean War. A variety of relatively small combatant vessels were also employed during the Korean War, minesweepers being among the most important. Minesweepers play a big role during the Korean War. These were small, shallow draft vessels used for detecting enemy naval mines, for conducting mine-clearing operations, and for using special buoys to mark minefields, mine-dumping areas, and swept areas. In order to reduce the chance of detonating magnetic mines, they were built with non-magnetic wooden and stainless steel hulls. And we'll see as we progress some of the mine-clearing operations that ended up being very key during the war, preparatory to amphibious operations. Submarines are another sort of specialized vessel and were used primarily for reconnaissance, sinking enemy shipping, and combating enemy submarines, but they played only a limited role in the waters off the coasts of Korea. A wide variety of specialized amphibious vessels were used during World War II and the Korean War to land the thousands of men and vast quantities of equipment, ammunition, and supplies needed to secure a foothold on an enemy beachhead. And those of you who know are familiar with World War II battle history and strategy know that toward the end of World War II, there were a lot of island hopping operations. The United States Army and the United States Marine Corps and Navy were conducting island hopping operations to roll up Japanese power in the Pacific. And a lot of the methodology that the services had acquired during World War II ended up being applied during the Korean War. And in fact, the Incheon landing, which was MacArthur's re-seizing of Incheon and Seoul from the North Koreans in September 1950, that really was the pinnacle of everything the U.S. military had learned during island operations, island hopping operations in World War II. So there really was a lot of earlier methodology that was being drawn on at this point. All right. Amphibious force flagships, we can see one there on the left, were used as command ships and communication centers during amphibious operations, like the Incheon landing, and provided accommodations and command and control facilities for the various Army, Navy, or Marine Corps commanders involved in an operation, as well as centralized facilities for processing and distributing operational intelligence information. Most amphibious force flagships were converted cargo vessels, but could be easily identified by the radio cage masts rising from their superstructures, which we can, in fact, see here, front and back on McKinley, which was MacArthur's amphibious force flagship. In addition to crew members, such ships could quarter about 250 officers and 900 enlisted men, were equipped with about a half dozen landing craft, and could carry a small amount of cargo and a few vehicles. So all things to support getting commanders ashore if they needed to in the course of an amphibious operation. Tank landing ships, which we see a lot in World War II, especially during the D-Day landing, were used for landing troops, vehicles, and other cargo directly on enemy shores via bow doors and a ramp that led into a huge hold called a tank deck. And we can see one there on the right, landing equipment and vessels or vehicles at Incheon. An LST could also be used to transport and launch a utility landing craft or pontoon causeway section. LSTs were critical in the execution of the Incheon landing, one of the greatest amphibious operations in history. Utility landing craft, smaller vessels, were open-decked barge-like craft with a bow ramp and could transport up to 50 tons of vehicles, equipment, and cargo from ship to shore. These are the landing craft that we would see landing at D-Day. There's that iconic image of that small landing craft with the ramp going down and troops coming out of it at D-Day. That's what we're looking at here, a utility landing craft. They could also be used for seaborne transportation under suitable conditions, but were generally carried to the site of an amphibious assault in the well of a dock landing ship. And dock landing ships were the largest type of landing vessels and were actually self-propelled floating dry docks and could transport and launch smaller amphibious vessels and vehicles. Such ships could also render limited docking and repair services to small ships. All right. And we're just going to look at the auxiliary vessels that were used to support naval operations, and then we're going to jump straight into what some of those operations were. And actually, I'll compress a little of this. A lot of these vessels are a bit less sexy than the combatant vessels. So I'll just give a quick overview of these, and then if anybody has any questions about any of them at the end, we can go back. While operating far from home ports, as in the waters around the Korean Peninsula, ships constantly needed to be supplied with food, fuel, munitions, men, mail, repair parts, and many other things. These things were delivered to the warships by a wide variety of auxiliary vessels, including replenishment vessels designed to transfer men and materiel from themselves to other ships while underway. We're going to look briefly, as I said, at a few of the most important auxiliary vessels used during the Korean War. Cargo ships were used to carry vehicles, equipment, munitions, and limited numbers of troops. Transports were used for rapid transportation of troops and limited quantities of cargo from port to port, and could also be used to evacuate casualties, troops, and refugees as they were from the North Korean port of Hungnam in December 1950, when the U.S. forces were being rolled up after the Chinese entry into the war. So U.S. and UN forces, South Korean, U.S. and other UN forces, had reached the Yalu River and the Chinese border, and they were driven back beginning in November 1950. And in December, thousands of them were evacuated from the North Korean port of Hungnam. Tenders, including those for destroyers and submarines, provided maintenance and supply services for the combatant vessels to which they were assigned. Ocean-going tugs were vessels used for hauling, towing, firefighting, and salvage operations, and included a number of different varieties. Repair ships were floating workshops with skilled mechanics, electricians, and other technicians aboard that performed repair and maintenance services that were beyond the capabilities of damaged vessels or their crews. Ammunition ships operated with groups of other replenishment vessels to deliver munitions to ships at sea. Oilers carried black oil, gasoline, and other petroleum products and operated with groups of replenishment vessels to deliver their cargo to ships at sea. And hospital ships. And some of these were provided by at least one Scandinavian country, maybe two countries, Norway being one of them, I believe, provided hospital ships. So there were a number of UN nations that didn't actually want to provide combatants to the Korean War, but they wanted to support the war effort in some way. So I'd mentioned a company of airborne medics that was provided by India. So that was India's contribution to the Korean War. Norway provided a hospital ship. So hospital ships were something that a number of countries provided during the course of the war. So they're used for transporting casualties or providing temporary medical care to them while en route to hospital facilities ashore. All right? So that's all we'll put into auxiliary vessels. But if anybody has questions about any of them, we can address that. Even as UN ground forces were struggling, often futilely, to contain the North Korean invasion of South Korea, UN naval forces were quickly seizing control of the waters around the peninsula. Once control of the coasts had been established, UN naval forces could use their big guns against enemy troops, supplies, and lines of communication and transportation. Use carrier-borne aircraft to provide close support to Allied troops or attack enemy targets anywhere on the peninsula, and land or pick up troops and materiel at any point on the Korean coast. So that's a very, very powerful capability to have this coast. You know, we're fighting over a peninsula, and to be able to access any point on the peninsula from the sea is actually a very, very, very powerful capability. And it bears mentioning, one of the better books about the Korean War, if y'all are interested in reading more, is called This Kind of War. And it's written by a military analyst named Fehrenbach. And in 1960, he wrote, if the United States could not win the Korean War with full control of the waters around the Korean Peninsula, it really, really, really had to be careful looking at this new thing that was starting to develop called Vietnam, because in Vietnam, the United States didn't have any of the advantages that it had in Korea. So this is very, very interesting that a military analyst wrote this, and that it was read widely by military officers and strategists in the 1960 era. And he really says, look, if we couldn't win in the Korean War when we had complete naval supremacy of this peninsula, we're not going to be able, under similar conditions, to win when we don't have that kind of supremacy around a peninsula. So just an interesting footnote to history. Whenever I hear the phrase, the mistakes of Vietnam have been forgotten, I say, well, yeah, and the Korean War's been completely forgotten, because all of those mistakes actually came out a decade or a decade and a half earlier during the Korean War. So the Korean War really does bear some looking at. All right. Naval supremacy was critical to the successes enjoyed by the UN forces in Korea. Allied forces would probably have been forced off the peninsula long before the 1953 armistice if they had not enjoyed the benefits of naval supremacy, or if the communists had had a similar naval advantage. On June 25, 1950, the same day North Korea invaded its southern neighbor, President Truman ordered the U.S. 7th Fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Arthur Struble into the Straits of Taiwan in order to prevent Chinese invasion of the island and contain the conflict to the waters around the Korean Peninsula. Remember, World War III was a phrase people used to throw around a lot, and there was a concern that the Korean War could escalate into a Third World War. And if the Chinese had crossed the Straits of Taiwan and invaded Taiwan, that very well might have happened. Task Force 77, a combined force of U.S., Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand warships, initiated their first shore bombardment of the war on June 29, 1950, when the light cruiser USS Juneau fired at communist targets on the east coast of Korea. So that's the first example we saw, and it was multinational task force that was doing it. On July 1, 1950, Truman ordered a blockade of North Korean ports in order to deny the communists access to the sea for either war or commerce, which they successfully did. The next day, on July 2, 1950, a UN force that included USS Juneau engaged in the only naval battle of the war, destroying 3 of 4 attacking North Korean torpedo boats in the waters off the east coast town of Chuminjin. On July 3, 1950, warplanes, so this is all early on in the first couple months, warplanes from USS Valley Forge attacked North Korean airfields around Pyongyang and Chinampo, the first of many carrier-based airstrikes against communist targets launched during the war. So these are all our firsts in the first 30 days or so of the war. By September 1950, the UN naval forces had eliminated North Korea's small coastal navy and achieved naval supremacy. China did not commit sea forces even after it entered the war, interestingly, leaving the UN naval forces largely unopposed. So China decided that it was going to support the war with ground forces, and it did. It committed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of troops starting in November 1950 to the war. It contributed pilots, but it decided for whatever reasons, possibly for purposes of not escalating the conflict, not to commit naval forces to the war. Nor did the Soviet Union, and it was assisting North Korea during this era as well. The famous landing at Incheon on the west coast of Korea, General Douglas MacArthur's masterstroke, would not have been possible without the support of the UN naval forces, which transported the attacking 10th Corps and provided supporting gunfire before and during the assault. From September 14 to 24, 1950, the UN naval forces engaged in their first major ship-to-shore bombardment in support of the amphibious assault at Incheon. Gunfire from the battleship USS Missouri, 3 cruisers and 5 destroyers ravaged North Korean positions on Incheon Harbor in nearby Wolmi Island. And here we can see MacArthur observing the shelling of Incheon from the U.S. Navy Amphibious Force Command ship USS Mount McKinley. And we'd had a view of McKinley earlier. U.S. ships deliberately drew shore fire from North Korean positions on Wolmi-do, a fortified island guarding the approaches to Incheon. Once the positions had been pinpointed by their muzzle flashes, the destroyers moved into a mere 1,000 yards from the shore, and along with the other ships, used their big guns to blow apart the enemy positions. So they completely neutralized the North Korean positions by coming in danger close and just blowing them apart. The next day, the Allied warships provided covering fire for the 1st Marine Division as it assaulted the seawall guarding the port of Incheon. And we can see a photo of the Marines assaulting the seawall at Incheon right here. Following the example of its Soviet mentor, and with no warships of its own at risk, North Korea made liberal use of naval mines in the waters around the peninsula, especially in shipping lanes and the approaches to its port cities. Such weapons, magnetic mines detonated by the presence of metal-hulled ships, and contact mines that exploded when touched by a target, were capable of severely damaging or destroying ships, and they inflicted a number of Allied losses. And we could see a ROK Navy minesweeper hitting one near the North Korean port of Wonsan. In the years after World War II, a tiny force of U.S. minesweepers were assigned to the dreary duty of clearing mines from the waters around Japan. When the Korean War broke out, these minesweepers were deployed to the waters around Korea to support the UN naval operations. Mines began to take a toll on UN vessels early in the war and continued to do so for the following 2 years. In October 1950, the U.S. Army 10th Corps amphibious landing at the North Korean port of Wonsan was delayed for a week in order to clear mines blocking the harbor. Minesweepers were only one method used to clear mines during this operation, and other methods include using scuba divers to clear mines, aircraft to spot underwater mine fields, and naval gunfire to detonate them. Most of these methods did not work very well, however, and the tedious but tried and true methods of the mine-sweeping crews proved most effective. This meant that losses from mines were consequently high. And here, as noted, we could see this ROK vessel going off in October 1950 near Wonsan. Several U.S. Navy destroyers, minesweepers, and other vessels were destroyed or badly damaged during the war by mines at a cost of at least 203 wounded, 86 killed, and 5 missing. And that's just for U.S. forces. And that's the minimum number. On June 12, 1951, the U.S. Navy suffered its greatest overall casualties of the war when the USS destroyer USS Walkie struck a mine, taking casualties of 26 killed and as many as 40 wounded. And enemy mines inflicted the last loss of a U.S. Navy vessel during the war on August 30, 1952, when the ocean-going tug USS Sarsai struck a mine off the North Korean port of Hungnam and sank, suffering 4 killed and 4 wounded. So that was all an aspect of the war that we really don't hear much about. You'd probably get a good movie out of it, frankly. Allied naval forces supported the UN mission throughout the course of the war in a number of other ways, including transportation of men and materiel to Korea from the United States and Japan, deployment of helicopters to rescue pilots downed at sea or behind enemy lines, reconnaissance and patrol operations, and bombing raids against communist targets. And here we can see, in what I think is kind of a cool picture, 4 U.S. Navy McDonnell F-2H-2 Banshee fighter aircraft flying over aircraft carrier USS Kearsarge following a combat mission. So they're on their way back. From August to December 1950, UN ships bombarded communist forces along the east coast of the Korean Peninsula, providing support for South Korean troops as they fought their way into North Korea and toward the Chinese and Soviet borders. In early December 1950, the warships of Task Force 90 provided covering fire for UN troops retreating toward the North Korean port of Hungnam after being stopped and driven back by 6 Chinese field armies. From December 3 to 6, 1950, UN ships evacuated more than 105,000 military personnel and 100,000 civilian refugees from Hungnam, and after it was abandoned, helped to destroy the port with a devastating barrage of naval gunfire. On February 16, 1951, Task Force 95, a UN blockade and escort force, established a blockade of Wonsan Harbor that lasted 861 days until July 27, 1953, the last day of hostilities during the war, before the armistice, making it the longest effective siege of a port in U.S. Navy history. So the U.S. set some records during the Korean War. Songjin was another important port that was besieged by UN naval forces during the Korean War. Task Force 77 suffered its worst one-day casualties of the war on May 18, 1951, when 6 of its aircraft were shot down and 4 of its pilots killed in action. And there was a lot of dogfighting going on between the Allied pilots and the Korean Air Force, which, as noted, was really dominated by Chinese and Russian pilots. On April 21, 1952, 30 men were killed when a powder fire broke out on the cruiser USS St. Paul while it was providing gunfire support from the waters off of the North Korean town of Kojo. On June 23, 1952, carrier-based aircraft participated, along with Far East Air Force warplanes, in a major raid against 9 hydroelectric plants in North Korea. So at that point, they're trying to break down critical infrastructure, break down manufacturing, and even support to the civil population. On August 29, 1952, UN carrier-based aircraft collaborated with the Far East Air Force in the largest single-day air attack of the war, with 1,403, it's a phenomenal number of planes, a 1,403 plane bombing raid on the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. So the Allied forces sent 1,400 warplanes to bomb Pyongyang in 1952, August 29. On September 1, 1952, the UN naval forces launched the biggest all-Navy air raid of the war, sending 144 planes from 3 aircraft carriers to bomb the oil refinery at Aoji in North Korea. On October 21, 1952, artillery fire from a communist shore battery near Wonsan struck USS Lewis, killing 7. So they didn't always operate with impunity. UN naval forces unleashed the heaviest shore bombardment of the war against Koh Sang on March 20, 1953. On June 15, 1953, as we're nearing what would be the effective end of the war, USS Princeton set the record for the most offensive sorties flown from a single carrier by launching 184 air attacks, contributing to a total of 910 sorties flown by Navy and Marine pilots, their greatest one-day combined total of the war. And total U.S. Navy casualties during the Korean War were 458 killed and 1,576 wounded from various causes, and that compares to total U.S. casualties of 38,000 killed throughout the course of the war, and then, of course, smaller numbers from the various Allied participant nations, and phenomenally larger numbers for the Republic of Korea and North Korea and China, though a lot of those numbers are unclear. And finally, we'll take a quick look at U.S. Coast Guard operations. A lot of people didn't even know the U.S. Coast Guard was active in the Korean War, but of course they were. Although it is a service usually associated with operations in domestic waters, the U.S. Coast Guard was active in the Korean War, and nearly 24 of its vessels supported the UN war effort during the conflict. And here we can see USS Coast Guard cutter Durant as it appeared during the war. Soon after World War II, the service's presence in Korea began when a U.S. Coast Guard advisory detachment helped to develop and train the Korean Coast Guard, a force that eventually became the Republic of Korea Navy. So when the United States was occupying South Korea after World War II, we helped to develop their Navy, which began as a Coast Guard and then was expanded into the Republic of Korea Navy, the ROK Navy. After the conflict in Korea began in 1950, 24 U.S. Coast Guard cutters were active in the theater of war, serving tours of duty at remote outposts and taking part in a wide variety of military and humanitarian operations. These included serving as plane guards, rushing to help air crews that went down at sea, and as acting as communication support platforms. Coast Guard cutters were also ready to provide support to troops and to supply ships on their way to or from Korea, and to help in the event of emergencies. Cutters also served on meteorological duty on 2 open ocean weather stations near Korean waters, from which they provided UN ground, air, and naval forces with information about weather patterns that could affect military operations. In the nearby Philippines, Coast Guard aircraft stood ready to rescue UN personnel in need of help, like the air crews of reconnaissance planes shot down over the China Sea. In 1952, the Coast Guard reached a strength of 38,082 officers and enlisted men, including 1,600 reservists, nearly double its strength just 5 years before. So the Coast Guard ended up doubling its strength during the course of the Korean War so that it could support operations there. Coast Guard personnel also manned and operated long-range aids to navigation, or LORAN stations, in the Pacific, 9 of which provided direct navigational support to UN aircraft and ships taking part in the conflict in Korea. Throughout the course of the war, a pair of Coast Guard cutters serviced these LORAN stations, one of which was based in southeastern Korea, near the port city of Busan. So we had a naval or a Coast Guard base there. 9 Coast Guard LORAN stations and 2 shore units were also eligible for the Korean Service Medal by virtue of their wartime activities. And in the United States, of course, Coast Guard proficiency in activities like cargo and ammunition handling, port security, and prevention of sabotage helped ensure the flow of supplies to and from the Korean theater of war. All right. Well, I hope that was enlightening for some of you and interesting. I am willing to take questions on anything related to the subject. What? Well, we've got 5 minutes, so we can take a couple questions about the Korean War at sea. If there's anything.